Coming up, the pick is in. Deonte Banks is joining Big Blue, and we break down if this is why, yes, in fact, the perfect fit for your New York Football Giants. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant podcast with our draft coverage for 2023. No reason to wonder where we've been on our hiatus of recent, Andy. We get into the action immediately, though, because there's plenty to talk about with Big Blue. Primarily, pick 25, nay, pick 24, Deonte Banks, cornerback is the pick for Big Blue. What was your just immediate reaction? And then we'll talk a little bit about how the board unfolded.
Yeah, so I think, in some of our coverage, I know you specifically talked about Deonte Banks as one of the guys to target. Obviously, we mentioned areas that are premium positions, areas of need. So the whole entire time, I'm just thinking to myself, are there going to be wide receivers? Are there going to be cornerbacks that we've targeted that are going to be there at 25? And, as we talk about the progression in a moment, start to get a little nervy there for a second. But the Giants, in getting Deonte Banks, address a huge area of need. And we talk about the fit for the Giants. You mentioned it before. He is a tall, physical, man press type of cornerback that thrives in a system like Wink Martindale's. And so when you match up the type of player with the skill set he has, the raw athleticism, 9.99 raw athletic score on the RAS scale. I don't know if that's good when it's out of 10, Adam, but that sounds pretty athletic to me. It seems like a great fit, knowing that we really don't have an answer on the other side of Rodori Jackson on the defense right now.
Yeah, I think, listen, you see the reaction from Wink Martindale inside of the draft room. He went over and bear hugged GM Joe Schoen somewhat aggressively, they would say. Had to kind of, peel him off of there a little bit. And I think we know that Wink Martindale is a blitz heavy scheme. He wants that to be his bread and butter. And you just mentioned it there. Deonte Banks is a guy that you can put on the outside. He can play in press coverage, go stride for stride down the field with the opposition's top wide receivers potentially here. And it really does change the dynamic. We know the Giants have Cordell Flott. We know that they have Dane Belton on the back end to go along with Xavier McKinney. I think the lean length of a Cordell Flott, well, we want to be able to plug him into, more specific positions and still have the option to kind of move these guys around a little bit. When it comes to Banks, I mean, you've done the both and here. You've put a player across from Adoree Jackson to pair with in the short term, and you feel like you've also put your starting corner going forward here. So we're only a year away from asking real questions about this secondary potentially. Now you feel like you've shorn that up. Other things, man, that I'll just say when you read about him, it's funny. When we went back and talk about when we were looking at these prospects, you asked me over on Twitter, we were kind of putting out our final picks, and I said Emmanuel Forbes, because I assumed Deonte Banks would be gone too soon. They actually flip-flopped, and Forbes went a bit earlier there in the mid-teens. So I didn't think that Banks was going to be there. The reason being is that press coverage, like we mentioned, physical player, like we mentioned, like he is day one ready to go out and compete at the highest level. And he also does a good job passing off of coverage, going into zone looks, going into the secondary if he's going to bite down near the line of scrimmage potentially, excuse me. So I think the football IQ seems to be getting checked there as well. I was ecstatic about this. I think the next thing to ask is, were you disappointed that if the Giants did move up, made the trade with the Jacksonville Jaguars, seemed to be making sure they got ahead of a couple of other teams that would have been in the market for a cornerback like Banks? Zay Flowers there at 23. That was the guy that you were hoping for. I said Addison was a nice secondary option. I personally feel like the wide receiver group, what we learned in the first round is that talent pool is a lot closer than we thought it was, maybe as far as where the first one's going to go versus where the 10th one is going to go. And it just makes sense to capitalize on a player like this in Banks, although I will give a caveat to that after I hear from you.
So, am I disappointed? No, because we addressed one of the two areas that I felt was an absolute must in the first round. If we weren't going to go with a wide receiver, we had to address the cornerback position. I started getting a little nervy, hoping that we weren't going to go look at the tight ends that were dropping, like Dalton Kincaid or
Yeah, you
Michael
freaked me out there a
Mayer.
little bit when I wasn't even thinking about tight ends, and you were like, "God, I hope." And I was like, what are you even doing here? And don't even bring that kind of added, conversation into this.
Well, and as we talk about how the board was breaking down, getting a little bit nervous, you start seeing those wide receivers go. And I messaged you when we got to, 17, 18, and I said, Jackson Smith and Jigma is still there. I'm like, how
Yes.
much do the Giants need to trade up if they want a player of his caliber? Because much like you didn't think Banks was going to be there for us at 25, I didn't think Njigba was going to last past 15. Never mind, going 20 to Seattle.
Mhm.
But once the Seattle Seahawks made the pick at 20, that began the run of all of the different wide receivers that I kind of had as first round talents for me. Sounds like the Giants felt the same way in terms of where their cutoff was.
Yeah.
You listen to Joe Schoen talk a little bit about, there was not necessarily, there was a little bit of panic, but not like we're going to do something out of desperation, just more we're seeing all of our first round grades go off the board. So we need to go and make sure we get the last guy that we have a first round grade on. That's Deonte Banks. Adam, a question for you. Do you
Yeah.
understand why there's a little faction of Giants Twitter that is upset at the draft capital that they gave up to move up one spot, which was a fifth round pick and a seventh round pick to go get Deonte Banks?
No. What are we talking about? You know what I mean? We actually, I don't know if you were describing this. I was seeing it some other places, looked up about you want to move up 2 or 3 spots in the first round, specifically in that 20s kind of area. It could cost you just a fourth. It could cost you a 6 and a 7, something like that. The Giants have multiple back end of the draft picks. Like this world where you talk about you gave up 2 late round picks to get up one spot to make sure that, again, the guy that you targeted and wanted to go get, name the players, man. And you and I get excited about these guys too, the late round picks. We dream on what they could be. Carter Coughlin is a great example, right? I was excited when they drafted him. He's nothing, and he's not going to be anything. And he might not even be on this roster. Like, so, I get the idea of like, oh, draft capital. It matters in the first round, the second round, the third round. And you can talk about the fourth round when there's value buys. We can talk about guys last year like a Darian Beavers, who we feel like when you draft him in the sixth, you may have gotten a fourth round value. But you can't sit here on day one of the draft at pick 25, 24 and say, boy, I don't love that we gave up picks in the 160s, 180s, 200s to go get a guy that you think is a day one stud starter. Like, it just seems like silliness to me, but that's this guy.
The Giants also have 3 seventh round picks, and like, yeah, it's great to draft a bunch of guys at the end to like throw some more lottery balls in the mix, or lottery tickets in the mix. But the Giants recognized that they had an area of need with a player that they thought fit perfectly for their defensive scheme. And so for me, like, moving up one spot to make sure you get the guy that was graded in the first round seems like just the cost of doing business. Now, if you told me we could have traded a fourth and a sixth to move up in front of the Seahawks and maybe get the top wide receiver in the draft,
Sure.
if those were the trade-offs, then maybe I would feel a little bit differently, but we just don't know that.
Yeah, and sometimes you hear these things later down the road. And in the past for the Giants, whether it was Dave Gettleman, whether it was Jerry Reese, there were years when you felt like after you walked away from the draft, the Saquon Barkley year, regardless of how much we all love him now, back then it was, don't answer the phone. Don't even answer the phone when people are calling to offer you trades. Like, that gets concerning, right? So we'll see how that unfolds. Before we turn our attention to where a little bit about what happened ahead of the Giants, first of all, but in this little isolated conversation, there's 2 things I want to ask you. One, Joey Porter Jr. still out there on the board right now. He's 6'3", technically sound, but another lean player, 6'3", 193. And then I even go back a hair here. When we look down the draft, the next guy, just in my mind, that I remembered looking and scouting and liking, and that was Kaylee Ringo, the 6'2", 207 out of Georgia cornerback, who currently is rated on ESPN's big board as the 50th overall player. So in terms of taking Banks here, I think when it comes to Joey Porter Jr., my stance is the Giants preferred Banks over Joey Porter Jr., a guy that was maybe higher and then has kind of shifted back here a little bit. But do you look at what's available into the second round at all and say the value discrepancy is not big enough on a Deonte Banks to not only move up for him, but to take him in the first round, as opposed to, when we don't know if the offers were there, trading back a little bit, staying in the first, and making some other type of decisions?
Yeah, I mean, when you're trading back, to me, it just concerns me. Yes, I want to get more draft capital and draft picks. If there's not a guy in a 5 to 7 range that you feel that strongly about or have conviction, sure, move back, take the extra pick, and go with the best player available there. The Giants clearly didn't feel that way. They felt like Deonte Banks was the last player
Yeah.
possible for them in the first round, and that's why they even moved up to be able to get someone like him. Listen, Joey Porter Jr. People said, do they have him ranked higher than Banks? Most people think that Banks is there.
Yeah.
4.35 speed. He is a
That's what it
blazer
is.
as
Yeah.
well as being crazy athletic. Like, he fits exactly what the Giants want to do. I don't know who was happier, Wink Martindale or Deonte Banks, in terms of like who's happier to have him in New York right now.
Yeah.
But listen, the Giants walked away and they checked a massive box in round one. And there's still some work to do in rounds 2 and 3 that we're going to talk about in a minute. But the way the board started shaping up early made all of us excited that we were going to have the pick of the litter. And then as we were getting closer to the pick, it started dwindling down where Deonte Banks was really the only guy that everyone felt comfortable with.
Listen, you asked me in a text, how did I feel about the pick? What would I grade it? I said A plus. I said it here. Now you're talking about, along with Adoree Jackson right now, along with Cordell Flott, you now add Deonte Banks, who's going to be a stud, I believe, going forward in Wink Martindale's system, along with Xavier McKinney, along with Dane Belton, right? You can start to see how this secondary can really take a big step forward in the upcoming season. And it doesn't mean that there won't be more talent added to this group across the draft. So that's where I stood on Deonte Banks. I was high on him. And you mentioned we almost glossed over it. 4.35 40 time for a guy that can play as physically as he can, and a guy that, even you want to say just at 6 foot with some of the bigger wide receivers, but he's a guy that can go up and high point that ball, just shows a great vision, head into the backfield of the quarterback, very disruptive, breaking up passes. I think he had 8 total in this past season, along with some interceptions as well. So I just do like, I love the pick. I love addressing a big area of need. And I'll let you close out here, but I will also mention, go back and look at what the Giants did across the offseason. What did they not add to? The secondary, right? So I think there is this path here, if we want to start to talk going forward about what were they able to do in the offseason and what did we know were still going to be big areas of need entering the draft.
Yeah, people might say, well, you're talking about how amazing he is. He's tall, he's athletic, he's got press coverage skills, he's got blading speed. Like, why isn't he going in the top 10? And the concerns that some teams had was his athleticism gets him out of trouble, where maybe sometimes his feet aren't that great or his
Yeah,
ball anticipation isn't that great getting to the ball. I believe he had 6 interceptions in total. Yeah, I think teams would like to see have a little bit more instincts in forcing some
sure.
more turnovers and just being in the right spot. His athleticism has gotten him out of that. But to me, you'd rather be able to have a guy that has all of the tools and all of the skill sets that you need to shape, rather
Yeah,
than a guy that doesn't have the speed, that has the instincts, but just gets blown by speed guys like Tyreek Hill. So for me, the reason why he lasted that long is those little concerns. But I think those are the ones that the coaching staff wants to coach him up. He's got the athleticism at him. I don't have it as an A plus the same way that you do. I have it as a B plus. I think it did everything that we need. But would I have preferred one of the top wide receivers when they started dropping back as far as they did? Maybe that was the only way I would have given it a higher grade.